Let's have a look at the deficiencies within the black culture that affects the black community. And let's have a look at the disproportionate levels of mental illness that plague particularly the African Caribbean community. Let's have a look at the disproportionate levels of black on black violence. Let's have a look at the disproportionate levels of black men in UK jails. And let's look at the level to which racism still affects us as a community. And the far-right commentators have commentated on this quite a bit. And that's why they've said that victimhood exists within black culture and within the black community, because we are still affected by racism where other groups and other cohorts are not affected by that. And so, you know, there's this commentary by Kemi Badenoch saying, you know, let's get rid of Black Lives Matter. Let's get rid of this wokeist because we're pointing to inequalities. And so why do we need to point to these inequalities when other ethnic minorities are getting on with it? And, you know, we exist in the 21st century. And I did a study looking at African Caribbean male achievement that I think helps us to understand this a bit better. And I had to look at the reason why other ethnic minorities were doing so well. I looked at the Chinese students that were outperforming their white peers and their African Caribbean peers. The Indian community that were outperforming their white peers. I was having a look at certain African students that were a particular African cohort that were outperforming their white peers and their African Caribbean counterparts. And at the source of this, I found cultural richness. That was what I found through my empirical data. It was cultural richness that was at the root of this process. And we can use two metrics to measure cultural richness. And that is language and also your name, your surname, that comes from the cultural reservoir from the geopolitical coordinates of your country of origin, your ethnic origin. And so these are the two metrics that you can use to measure culture, cultural richness. And so the Indian students obviously have their own language and they have their own surnames that belong to that cultural identity. So do the Chinese. And so did a particular cohort of African children. The African Caribbean doesn't. And a large proportion of the black community doesn't, especially in Britain. We have British surnames that belong to our colonial slave masters of the past that we've kept on and adopted. Our original culture has been shattered and destroyed, our original civilization. We have been shattered and we have been dispersed and belong to a diaspora. We are literally scattered seeds, which is diaspora in Greek. Literal translation, scattered in mind, body and spirit. And so those are the two metrics of cultural richness that exist. Now let's look at that in terms of achievement and in terms of getting on and in terms of resilience against racism. There are two components that I want to bring our attention to. The first one is ontology and the second one is epistemology. Ontology is the nature of being. What is the nature of your being? That's one of the cornerstones of achievement, ontology, okay? That demarcate the philosophy of self. What is the nature of being? What tells you that you are in existence? What is your unique interaction with the phenomenal world? And your own unique cultural language helps you to define your experience, your empirical reality, to understand the phenomena that's coming at you and how you're responding to it, your unique relationship with it. And that's what language does. It defines your experience on those terms, helps to structure your consciousness in order that you understand yourself completely and you can understand your universe and understand knowledge in relation to yourself. That's what produces knowledge. Knowledge of self produces knowledge of the wider world because you can understand it in relation to yourself on your own cultural terms. You can understand the world in relation to yourself. And that is true knowledge. Okay? And those are the two cornerstones. Ontology, the nature of being, that produces the root of knowledge, which is epistemology. And those are the two things that allow you to be independent and to excel. Knowing yourself and understanding the universe in relation to yourself. That's what knowledge is. And that's what comes from cultural richness. Just want us to understand the relevance of cultural richness in relation to achieving and getting on in the world. And the kids that had this cultural richness, who understood themselves and were able to have their own mode of learning mapped out completely, were the ones that excelled because they knew themselves. They were culturally rich and therefore academically rich. And so I point again to Kemi Badenoch, okay? Let's look at her as an example of this, okay? Because she came from Nigeria. And her maiden name or Nigerian name was Olukemi Olafunto Odegoke before she married Hamish Badenoch and became Mrs. Badenoch, or Kemi Badenoch as we have her now. She first was able to master the Nigerian dimension of herself, the Afrocentric personality that was mapped out by a particular cultural language of richness, and what she was called through her name that belonged to a particular cultural rich identity. So she understood herself in relation to the phenomena that was being mapped out in terms of language and her place in all of that, her unique essence, who she was as an individual, which was demarcated by a Nigerian name. So she was able to master the Afrocentric dimension of her personality and was therefore rooted. And that's what allowed her, as I've said in a previous post, to go on and be the leader of the opposition Conservative Party. But she's tricking her constituents and the people that are voting for her in saying that Black Lives Matter has no relevance and the wokist. No, it matters for people who don't have themselves together, Kemi. And I talk to you directly. And I would love to debate you directly on this issue. You are being disingenuous because you know that it is important to have that strong cultural orientation in order to know self and thereby to know the universe and therefore to have that conservative autonomy. To be together. Okay? And you came from a very rich Afrocentric background of language and of your original Nigerian name, which is representative of that cultural richness. Why would you think that other black people don't require that same rootedness and that same cultural richness in order to understand the Afrocentric dimensions of their personality? Isn't it logical? If it worked for you, why does it not work for the rest of us that need that, who need to understand themselves? That's not unique to black people. Europeans need to understand themselves on their own unique terms. Asian, Indian need to understand. Chinese need to understand on their own unique terms. None of them have had their culture smashed to pieces and their consciousness shattered of their people to such an extent as the African. And that's why we're not getting on. Forget reparations of money. We don't need to discuss any money. Let's talk about the money it will cost to put the educational and societal infrastructure in place to piece back together again the shattered consciousness. So that the black psyche is put back together again, like Humpty Dumpty on the wall, and we can have our own autonomy and be able to get on in our own conservative element, which is what you want us to do. So then the infrastructure needs to be there, the educational infrastructure, okay, and the societal community infrastructure, resources in there to make sure that the psyche is put back together again and black people can master themselves and thereby master the wider world and get on with the world and not complain about racism anymore.